recording here. So we'll be able to access this presentation later for anybody that isn't able to join us. And then I'm going to share my screen real quickly here. All right. So, you know who is kind of on here except for me. My name is Gaard, and I am the Aquatic Ecology Education Specialist with the Nebraska Game and Parks Fish and Wildlife Education Division. So yeah, I'm part of this kind of relatively new division, but we focus all on education, and my passion is definitely, I love wetlands. I think they're amazing. So this month we've been presenting different topics, and this final presentation is about wetland wildlife in Nebraska. So if you want to, in the chat, you can put your favorite wetland wildlife animal, whatever that might be. I always find it interesting to see what people are most inspired by or find most interesting. There's a lot of different types of wildlife that rely on our wetlands. So obviously I can't probably hit them all today because that would take way too long. But I kind of, the way you can kind of think about it in our wetlands, we're going to have our mammals, lots of different invertebrates, like more than we can even try to put a number on almost, and many of those rely specifically on wetlands for sure. And then we've got our reptiles and amphibians. So in Nebraska, actually, we have 14 species of amphibians, and 100% of those rely on our wetland ecosystems in Nebraska. So that's not a ton of species, but having each one rely on a wetland definitely is an important thing to note. And then of course we have different fish species that live in these wetlands, and then birds. And last Tuesday I did a presentation about just common wetland birds. So I think Amber put that link in the chat. There is a YouTube channel that we have that's called American Wetlands Month. And at the end of this presentation, I will send you guys kind of a feedback survey, and it will have links to all of these things if you don't get them right now. So just keep that in mind. And then obviously, like I kind of mentioned, invertebrates, that consists of not necessarily just insects, but also things like crayfish and mollusks, like snails. So those are things to just keep in mind. All right. And it's also important to make sure you keep in mind that wetlands are the most productive natural system in Nebraska. So that just means they have qualities that allow them to support lots of species and produce a lot more of themselves. That includes plants. This is good.
Yeah. Do you need anything, Grace?
Yeah, can you hear, is it working, Amber?
I can hear you, but I think your video, at least for me, is frozen. And then I see like a
okay
gray box.
Yeah, it's saying like Zoom meetings is not responding. So I don't know, I should maybe close this one and have everyone rejoin.
That's happened a few times over the last year where Zoom itself is kind of having some issues. If everyone has the link still, if you're able to, Grace, if you want to just do that and just end the meeting,
yeah,
everyone should be able to keep recording.
Okay, I'll try closing this and then everybody just rejoin. I'm very sorry. All right, how's that? Let's see here. Is that working okay now? Okay. I'll just
Sorry. It's happened before though, no worries.
love technology.
Yeah, if you just wanna, oh, it's recording again, good.
Yeah.
It looks like we have most of our participants again, so just share your screen and try again.
All right, thanks for your patience, everybody. I'm sorry. All right, I will go ahead and keep us moving here. So, like I was saying, there's a lot of different varieties of animals, plants that are kind of a result of wetlands. They come from them and they're supported by wetlands. So that makes wetlands a really productive ecosystem. And it's important for us to just quickly cover what is a wetland and you know, how do we determine what that is versus, you know, a different ecosystem. So the main three things to keep in mind are soil makeup. So you know, that soil in that top picture, I know it looks kind of really crusty and like it's very dry, but really a lot of the soil is forms over time in wet areas. And if it were to get wet after being dry, it would get soaked in right away, because they're just kind of a very spongy type of a soil and they hold a lot of water. So also, the plant communities are very unique in wetlands. They are used to being inundated or covered in water much of the time, or at least they're used to some water being there, especially during the growing season. So you're going to definitely see unique plant community. And then also the hydrology. So just the fact that there's going to be water there during those growing seasons usually. And so that's going to be something that you will see in a wetland. It's got those three characteristics, and obviously the water is a large part of that characteristic. So yeah, so those are kind of the three things that make up a wetland: the soil, the plants that you can find there, and the water. So when we're talking about wetlands in Nebraska, it's kind of important to think to kind of know that there are different types of wetlands or different ways that we categorize them. So this is going to look like this map that I have on the screen right now. So we call them Nebraska's wetland complexes. And this is a really basic map, but it gives you a good idea of what I mean. So green, we've got Sandhill Wetlands. That orangish yellow is the Playa Wetlands, found kind of in the rainwater basin, and they are sort of are in areas near the Platte River and just, you know, running through those agricultural areas. We've got Riverine Wetlands, and then the Saline Alkaline Wetlands. And I'll kind of go into depth. So what I did is I split the wildlife that we're going to talk about today into basically the wetland types that you could find them in. But if you see the text I put on here is waters are connected. So it's important to keep in mind that I might have put one type of animal in the saline wetlands category, but it is maybe an animal species that you could find in other parts of Nebraska as well. So keeping that in mind, that water is connected, that means nature isn't always going to fit into the box that we put it into. So just keeping that in mind, that you know, animals don't stick to boundaries that we give them, and they still could possibly be found somewhere else. And there's a lot of research usually on sightings and where they've been documented as well. So yeah, keeping in mind these different wetland complexes. So before we go any further, I have a poll. Hopefully it works. And so I am curious, which wetland type do you live nearby? So I put that in there, and I'll give you a little bit of time if you want to go ahead and vote for which type of wetland you live near according to this map. I'll maybe give you about 3 more seconds. All right, so I'll share the results here. Most people are in the Saline Wetlands, and then we have people in the Playa and the Riverine and also urban wetlands or other. So it is important to keep in mind that just because this wetland, this map shows different wetland types, it doesn't mean that the white areas don't have wetlands. So there are different other, they wouldn't necessarily be considered a certain type, but there are still going to be wetlands found in some of these spaces that are white. So just something to keep in mind. But you know, scientists, we like to categorize things and make them fit more into an order so we can make sense of them. So first wetland type that I'm going to kind of use to focus on wildlife is the Sandhill Wetlands. And so obviously these are more north, kind of the central northern Nebraska. If you've never been to the Sandhills before, this is where a lot of the water in the ground, so groundwater, intercepts with the surface of the land. So there will be many sand dunes, and they do have grass on them, so they're not really quite like desert sand dunes you might think of. But then between each of these hills, there are a wetland oftentimes. And so especially when it's, you know, maybe rained as well, so the water table is super high, that's going to mean you're going to find these. So they're very unique. They have, obviously most of them will have kind of a sandy bottom, and so that determines some of those species you might find there. So one of the first species to talk about is the Blandings turtle, and they're a really cool turtle species. And they actually, a lot of their populations are declining across the Midwest, except for in the Sandhill Wetlands. That's kind of their big stronghold for Blandings turtles. So I know that there's currently research being done on these turtles to kind of find out why this is the spot that they tend to do very well. And a part of that, if we think about the habitat they prefer, is shallow water with soft bottoms and dense vegetation. So that's a pretty good description of what a lot of those wetlands are like that you could find in the Sandhills. So, and I thought there's a really cool story that goes along with the Blandings turtle. It's also can be called the turtle with the sun under its chin. And there's like a Chippewa story that talks about how there was a trickster spirit who stole the sun from everyone else, and the turtle decided to sneak in and swallow the sun and steal it back and take it back and release it back out into the world. And to be remembered for doing that, it has the yellow chin. So I thought that was there's some really cool stories like that out there for how animals are named, and just, so I thought that was a really great description of the Blandings turtle.
Grace, I've never heard that before, and I love that. That's so cool.
Yeah, I found it on some.
I was also going to share.
Yeah, go ahead.
When we had, when I worked with our Blandings turtle, when I worked at Schramm Education Center, we were told by Dennis Ferraro, who is our state herpetologist, that we need to make sure that we are always including crayfish. Actually helps give them that yellow in those spots. So something in the nutrients of their diet contributes to that yellow color, which is kind of cool.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for adding that, Amber. I did not know that.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I did find that one of their main, at least meat sources are crayfish, and then they'll also eat frogs and fish and invertebrates. And then they might eat some other vegetation like berries. And so, but it is cool to keep in mind some of those yellow spots, and just that might be because of the nutrients that the crayfish are giving them. So there's always so much more to learn about these wildlife that we have in Nebraska. So thanks for sharing that, Amber. Yeah, so Blandings turtle, that's a really a species that is very much one that you would probably find in the Sandhills. And then I've got a couple fish species that I decided to include, and they might not always be in a like a body of water that's not moving, but I do think that they are important to bring up because both of these fish species are threatened species in the state of Nebraska. So they are small. They only get up to 3 to 5 inches long. the northern red-bellied dace, which you can see the male in that photograph has a nice red stripe kind of under that middle black line. So that would be a good way to see, to know and identify that that's what you're seeing. And then the fine-scaled dace is another small minnow species. And these are called glacial relic species. They definitely prefer colder water, which many of our cold water areas, like cold water streams, or at least headwaters of small creeks, would be found in the sandhills. So these, it's important we don't forget about our fish, and these aren't game fish, so we don't talk about them as often, but you know, they rely on an ecosystem that is a little bit threatened, and the sandhills are an amazing ecosystem that thankfully has been preserved pretty well, thanks to, you know, ranchers who manage their land actually very well. So, but these are two fish species and that rely on obviously our water resources. And then also the black nose shiner. So this one is actually, I didn't put it on this slide. Oh no, I did. This fish is an endangered species in the state of Nebraska. So the other two were just threatened, which is a step below. This fish species is actually endangered, but it will eat algae and crustaceans and insects. And it definitely prefers those clear streams with sparse vegetation. So that would be probably more common in a stream than necessarily a wetland where all the water is still, but those are all connected, like I said. So, and it's good to note that any sign of this fish will indicate extremely good water quality. So we'll kind of talk about that at the very end. We've got some really good species to look for when we're trying to figure out what water quality is like in a wetland. And so, yeah, this is a good indicator in the sandhills would be finding maybe a black nose shiner. So again, a very small fish, doesn't get very large, which is why photographs of them are really useful, because otherwise they are kind of hard to spot while you're out there. And then one other, this species probably could be found in other wetland types, but I just decided to include it because I've seen it in a sandhill wetland area. The barred salamander, also called the tiger salamander, or even the tiger barred salamander. People kind of have seen them. They used to see them very often, and so they've got a lot of names. But this species is showing the beginning signs of species decline. So I've heard plenty of people tell stories. I think there was even recently an article about how these species are not seen as often as they used to be seen. And so there's a lot of questions that scientists are asking, and I don't know that there's specific research projects yet that are really diving deep into why we're not seeing these, but I know it's something that people are considering. And so it is important to think about our wetland habitats tend to be the most threatened, you know, because people have their own uses for water, and so these shared habitats, we kind of tend to take away some of that habitat, and then barred salamanders maybe don't have as much of that they need. So they also, just a note that they like to eat invertebrates like many other species, worms, crickets, and much more. They actually live a pretty long time too. I think at the different nature centers I've worked at, we had at one of these centers, we had a tiger barred salamander that lived at least 10 years, I think. So they actually can live a pretty long time.
Grace,
Oh, go ahead.
I just want to let you know, that's so cool. I worked at a zoo and we had a tiger salamander years old.
Oh, how old was it?
2.
Oh, did you say 22?
Yes, I did.
Okay. It just keeps cutting out right when you say it. So
it's okay. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, that is
really
insane.
Surprising they live so long.
Yeah, it really is, because if you know anything about amphibians, they do have very porous skin, and some of them can be very sensitive to changes in water quality. So I would say that the barred salamander might be at least historically, maybe it was a little resistant to big changes, but as we said, they're showing some signs of maybe species decline. So we'll have to be looking into why that might be happening. And cool thing about them, they start out their life in the water as some people call them mud puppies. There's lots of names for them, but they have these like weird looking tentacle things that stick out of the side of their face. but those are actually just gills that pick up the oxygen out of the water so they can breathe. So they're a really cool species that, you know, definitely depends on water, aquatic habitat, and wetlands to kind of go through their life cycle process. So those are just some general species that you would probably find in the Sandhill Wetlands. Now we're going to go to the Playa Wetlands. Now these are kind of made up of there's some different distinctions between them. There's a rainwater basin, but these are going to be usually wind-formed wetlands. So they're kind of a circular shape. And a lot of times they're in agricultural lands and they're what we call ephemeral. So they come and go, they're not always there. And a lot of times they depend on precipitation to exist. So they're a unique wetland compared to the sandhills for sure. So I did talk about birds in a separate presentation, but I can't talk about the Playa Wetlands without mentioning at least one bird. So I put the white-fronted goose in here. There are so many other duck species, goose species, and many more that depend on the Playa Wetlands when they're migrating through Nebraska. We're in the central flyway, so they're going to migrate through the middle of Nebraska and kind of stop over in these habitats and eat while they kind of rest and then continue on. So they are very productive wetlands that help. They kind of provide them with good food as they travel. So the white-fronted goose is maybe less common. You know, obviously the Canada goose is the one that everyone sort of knows. And so they'll eat grasses and sedges, berries, plant tubers, which is like their roots, and then grains and seeds. And then they, again, like those, they also like wet meadows. Wet meadows are kind of a part of those Playa Wetlands where they're just saturated areas with lots of vegetation. So that's kind of where they like to hang out and rest. And they're very social birds that will gather, they'll fly in the strong V formation as they're migrating. And you can kind of see them between February and May. So this is just one goose species, and there's a lot of other ducks. I don't mention here because I just don't have time to talk about them all. But if you ever look into this or the Rainwater Basin Joint Venture Project or like group, there's probably a lot more information out there that you can find on all these species that you might be able to see here. You also have I decided to include the northern crayfish in the Playa Wetlands. However, the northern crayfish probably would be found almost all the way throughout Nebraska. The only place that it really wasn't included for its range was the top northwestern corner of Nebraska. So very widespread, but it would definitely live in these kind of spaces that are in those Playa Wetlands. And their main diet is fish eggs and sac fry, which sac fry, if you don't know, are when a fish hatches out of its egg. A lot of the times it's really vulnerable and it actually will have a sac attached to its body that's kind of like a yolk sac, and it contains all the nutrients they need before, so they don't really need to eat for a while. And so that's something the crayfish would like to eat, and then obviously a lot of invertebrates. And like I said, they're very widespread. And they're kind of unique as well because they don't really burrow. Most of our other species, there are actually 5 species of native crayfish to Nebraska. And so this is one of them. Most of the rest of those would burrow, but this species doesn't really make burrows. And so that means if the temperatures get really cold, they're pretty susceptible to freezing. So I think if they had to go underground, they'd use a hole that something else made. Instead of maybe digging their own, but I think they're capable of doing it. They just don't do it very often. So that's one species. There's other species they're called the devil crayfish, calico, ringed, and then I'm definitely going to forget the last one. But there are 5 species, and then there are a few others that were introduced. So yeah, crayfish, they're an essential part of a lot of other animals' diets as well. So important animal to find in our wetlands. And I also put the muskrat in here. It's obviously a mammal that you can find all across Nebraska in different types of wetlands, but You could find it in the Playa Wetlands, and based on some research I did, they actually used to be a lot more common in Playa Wetlands, but they think that maybe due to some sedimentation, so that's when, you know, water runs off into these wetland spaces, they carry with them lots of soil, agricultural chemicals, things like that. But they tend to fill up those wetlands sometimes with that soil that runs off, maybe off of a field into the wetland. And so muskrats like it when it's deeper because then they can usually go under in the winter and find food during winter. So because these wetlands change a lot, it's probably a somewhat of an explanation of why muskrats maybe don't use them as much anymore. But they are an herbivore. They like cattails and wild rice and water lily roots, and they'll just eat all those different parts of the plants. And I'm sure if you've driven past some of even urban wetlands, you'll see a lot of those mounds. A lot of those mounds are all from, are usually from muskrats, and they will make kind of little lodges in essence, like a miniature of a beaver lodge. But they also like to make dens. And so in Nebraska, it's a little more common, at least when they're overwintering, they'll use a den. And then it's kind of crazy. They can have up to 2 to 3 litters per year with 10 young in each of those litters, which is crazy. So if it kind of makes sense when you think about it, they're a species of rodent, so they are able to kind of reproduce pretty quickly. And yeah, as I said, used to be a little more prevalent in the rainwater basins than they are now. So the muskrat, very, very adaptive mammal, I would say. And then I also put in here the plains spadefoot, which toad is what we would call it. It's actually not really a true toad because it doesn't, you can see its eyes kind of stick up off of its head. So it's missing the crest that usually a toad would have around, and the eyes kind of sit underneath that. And then they actually have more smooth skin compared to a lot of our toads in Nebraska, have very bumpy skin. So obviously they love to eat insects. And I thought this was fascinating. When their tadpoles are hatched, half of them are herbivorous, which means they eat plants, and half of them are carnivorous, eating meat. And the reason for this is to ensure better survival. And so because they have such a short window when they're laying their eggs into a playa wetland, which might dry up in a few days, they ensure survival of their young, because if there's no herbivorous, plant material that they can really eat, then that means the half of them that are carnivorous and would eat meat will just eat the herbivorous tadpoles. And so they're kind of cannibalistic as well. So very fascinating strategy for them to be able to survive and continue their population. So, and they do spend most of their time in maybe a grassland or prairie habitat, but then they use those ephemeral pools that make a really good breeding ground. So the plains spadefoot toad, there are other types of spadefoot toads, but this one is a really unique one that we have in Nebraska. So yeah, so I think that's it for our playa species. And then I have riverine wetlands up next. And so this type of wetland is, in Nebraska, we have a lot of miles of river. And so we also have lots of streams, and a lot of these spaces have floodplains surrounding them. And this is where you're going to find a lot of these species. And now, again, some of them you'll find in other habitats as well, or other wetland types. But of course, I can't talk about wetlands without talking about the beaver. It is a large rodent. It's the largest rodent actually in North America. And it's an herbivore. So I know they have those large front teeth. And I know when I talk to students, a lot of times they think maybe they eat meat. Even if they just see the skull, they see these giant teeth. But they're very flat and they are very strong. They continuously grow, so they kind of have to keep eating or chewing on things so that that kind of manages their teeth as well. But when you see them eating on things like a big cottonwood, they're not eating the bark, they're just kind of eating underneath. That is the newest growth on the tree, so they'll be eating that. They'll eat lots of twigs and branches. And actually the best way, I used to actually lead canoeing in the Fontenelle Forest wetlands. And the best way I would know that a beaver dam is the only place I've ever seen a beaver lodge in Nebraska. So I know there are some in other places, especially along the Platte River, but this was the only place growing up that I ever saw a lodge in Nebraska. And so the best way I knew it was active was when we hit fall canoeing, I'd be out there and there would be lots of fresh willow branches and all kinds of branches from trees that they would store up around the base of their lodge. And that is like their food storage for the winter. So even when it's frozen on top, they can still reach it by going and grabbing from it underwater. So they're a really cool species, and they do, you know, if a big storm comes through, they make adjustments to their lodge. They'll add mud and all kinds of things to it and try to fortify that. And then that's also where they raise their young. But in Nebraska, they will also sometimes have a den. So they are pretty unique species, and they're adaptive to different aquatic environments. But they definitely love riverine wetlands. So those wetlands that are in floodplains and are kind of constantly changing, but they're pretty good at changing with it so that their home is preserved. So yeah, dams can be diverse because of that. Another species that I, of course, can't talk about or can't leave out is the river otter. And so this is a carnivorous species. So fish are the main thing that they would eat, but then they also eat crayfish, amphibians, they'll eat mammals, even a small bird. They're pretty predatory animals. I know even sometimes our fish hatcheries have issues with them. We really had a very low population of river otters, but it's a pretty good success story in terms of we reintroduced a lot of that population, and it has really taken off, and they're much more common, I think, in Nebraska now than they were before because they were taken off the endangered species list. So that's definitely a cool success story that we have. They're, I believe, a mustelid, so they're kind of part of the weasel family, and you can see that by that lower picture. They have a very long, skinny body, and yeah, they actually could be found along any of Nebraska's rivers, and because their population has grown, they've really can be found all over. And then they find their prey, and if they're in a really clear river or stream, they're gonna just use eyesight, but if they're in something murkier where they can't really see what they're doing, they have those big whiskers on the front of their face that they'll use. And I didn't put these in here, but I didn't put a mink slide in here. So if you've never heard of a mink before, a mink is kind of, in a way, it looks similar to a river otter, but much smaller, much smaller. And so that's another mammal that's kind of in the same family as a river otter that could be found in Nebraska's riverine wetlands. So just another species to keep in mind. I wish I would have had enough space for that, but there's just too many animals to talk about. If you were in some of our other presentations, we had a really fantastic presentation from Becca Yates. She's from Roe Audubon Sanctuary. She talked all about the sandhill cranes and their use of those riverine wetlands along the Platte River. So the sandhill crane, they migrate through Nebraska. It's like one of the largest, the biggest piece of their population comes right through our state. And there's some really great, if you've never seen it before, it's pretty amazing to go watch and just listen to them. And they spend their time in some of those fields surrounding the riverine wetlands as well, eating those plant tubers, insects, different reptiles and amphibians. So sandhill cranes are a pretty fantastic species and a good one to know in Nebraska. And then the bald eagle. So the bald eagle can be found in other wetland types, but I thought the riverine wetland was most appropriate to put it in there. They were once an endangered species, and a big reason for that was that there were chemicals used in farming called DDT, and a lot of the buildup of that, so they weren't directly applied anywhere to a bald eagle, but because ecosystem, everything goes kind of in a pyramid. So, it was on these plants, insects eat the plants, all that energy transfer goes up until it's really concentrated. So those chemicals were really concentrated at the top of the food chain, which is raptors, like a bald eagle. So bald eagles would then try to lay on their eggs in their nest and actually crush their eggs because the eggshells would be so thin due to this chemical. So they're similar to the river otter. The bald eagle is another really good success story of conservation efforts to bring back a species. And now I know I see lots of bald eagles. They are not as rare to see. I was actually just at Holmes Lake about a week ago and I saw one fly over there. So they've made a really great comeback, and they will hunt fish. I actually was also just out at Conestoga Lake last week and saw one swoop down and try to catch something. So they like to eat carrion and other dead animals that they might find. So bald eagles, they're a really cool bird, obviously our national bird, and glad that they made a good comeback. So I also wanted to touch on the pallid sturgeon. So the pallid sturgeon is a pretty long fish. They spend mostly all their time in the really rough, kind of turbid waters of the Missouri River, and sometimes might venture into the Platte River, but you could find them in these spaces. And they begin by eating lots of insects and invertebrates and eventually maybe switch to more of a fish diet. But this is an endangered species in Nebraska, and a big part of that, there's multiple reasons, but humans have altered rivers and those habitats a lot. They're really susceptible to pollution, changes because of we deepened them to make them easier to take boats on and channelized it to make it straighter and less inconvenient for us. But a lot of times that reduces the habitat's quality. So they don't have as many good sandbars and backwaters and just areas to go ahead and spawn. And then a big part of that is that the females won't be ready to spawn until they're at least 15, if not maybe in their 20s. So makes it very hard. Imagine most animals don't live past like 3. So it's pretty crazy, this species is. And if you've never seen one before, Amber was mentioning Schramm Aquarium. They do have some pallid sturgeon there, so it'd be definitely something I'd recommend checking out because they're a really cool fish species, and there's still a lot of research being done on those and efforts by fisheries staff to build their population back up. But they depend on riverine wetlands for sure. And then the smooth softshell turtle. There are actually 2 types of softshell turtles in Nebraska. So the smooth and the spiny. I just decided to talk about the smooth. They really like larger rivers and riverine wetlands with sandbars and those wetland areas that are sandy. So that's what they prefer. They'll eat invertebrates and mollusks, and they enjoy basking in the on the top of the sand instead of on a log. So you might see them kind of beached up on the sand, sunning themselves, versus a lot of our turtle species like to, hang out on logs. So, and then obviously their shell is much more of a leathery texture. You're not going to be like a snapping turtle where they're very hard shell. So the smooth softshell turtle, and the big way to identify them is that they do have this line extending down from their eye that's outlined in kind of a darker, almost black color. So that's a big way that you would maybe distinguish them from a spiny softshell turtle. But for the most part, they do look fairly similar. So we're going to go to our last wetland type, I believe, that I'm going to talk about today, which is the saline and alkaline wetlands. So this little spot that's over kind of in the Lancaster County area is this more of where you would find those saline wetlands, which just means they're going to be salty, and a lot of the salt might come from groundwater or from evaporation, which concentrates the salts in the water. And then the alkaline, a lot of times you'll find alkaline wetlands actually even in sandhills, in the Sandhill Wetlands, but you might also find them up there along, I think that's also the North Platte River. So you're going to be able to find them up along there. So I also couldn't not mention at least one type of snake, and I decided to focus on 2. Let's see. Yeah, so the northern water snake, I have a coworker who loves snakes and very passionate about them. And she said to make sure to mention the northern water snake because it's often, misidentified as a water moccasin. So we probably really won't see water moccasins in Nebraska. We will maybe get the Massasauga, which I think might also look similar. But this northern water snake, it's not venomous. It might be aggressive if you're around it, but it is not a water moccasin. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And they would be in wetlands around Nebraska, not necessarily just saline wetlands, but this is an area where you could be likely to see them. And they eat mainly, fish and amphibians, and we'll also find, birds that are nestlings on the ground, and mammals as well. So most of these ground dwelling animals are going to eat something if it fits in their mouth, just because, they're trying to survive and find food. But the important thing to note is it's not a water moccasin, so there are some differences there. And then I wanted to mention the plains garter snake, which you can see there's two pictures up there, and that's because there are two actual color varieties. There's one that has kind of that red that runs along the black and yellow line, and then there's the other more like brown line that runs down the other color pattern. So plains garter snakes will be found in wetland areas across Nebraska as well, and including the saline wetlands. They're also not venomous really in Nebraska. The rattlesnake is, I think it's the western rattlesnake, is going to be found maybe, on the western half of the state, but not super commonly. So good thing to know. If you see them, just give them space. And if you're not a fan of snakes, but they are really cool and an important predator in our ecosystems. They help keep them balanced. So let's see. And actually last week on Thursday, Ted LaGrange and Sean Dunn talked about the saline wetlands specifically and the Salt Creek tiger beetle. So I don't go into depth too much here, but you could watch that presentation if you want to know a lot more about Salt Creek tiger beetles than what I have here. But they are insectivores, so they'll eat other small insects, whether when they're larvae or when they get older and look more like the adult you can see in this photo. They are an endangered species, so they are the only species that is strictly endemic to Nebraska, which means it's found here and it's found nowhere else on the planet. So we have a very unique ecosystem with the saline wetlands, and there are many conservation efforts that work to preserve this type of wetland, which I believe Ted mentioned in the last presentation. So I can make sure I put the link in there, but also a lot of our local zoos in Lincoln and Omaha have helped on projects to help this species with reproduction and just reintroducing them out there. So they like those salt flats with the, they're just kind of flat and muddy, and they're not always, high water, but they might be sometimes. So the Salt Creek tiger beetle, definitely a really interesting species, and there's a great photo on here by Ethan Fries, who's from the Platte Basin Time Lapse Project, and we had a separate presentation with them. So just lots of really cool things going on with wetlands in Nebraska. I'm sorry, I see a lot of things popping up in the chat, but I haven't read them, so I'm almost through this part, and then I can pause and we can.
It's all good. It's great comments, but we got no
okay, perfect. The Regal fritillary butterfly is a also kind of like at least a threatened species, if not endangered, in Nebraska. So it's a type of butterfly species that their larvae feed almost exclusively on grassland violets. So I think that's probably a big reason why they are kind of struggling. Their adults will also use milkweed, thistle, clover, and purple coneflower. And so the saline wetlands are definitely a spot where a lot of those plants might grow, or on the edges of those wetlands. And so you would be able to possibly sight one of these rare butterflies in the saline wetlands. So they're a really cool species. Again, like I said, not strictly found in wetlands, but they would utilize the areas around them. So kind of watch for those if you ever see those kind of grassland violets. That might be a good indication that you might see a Regal fritillary. So I also have a name that's just very hard to say. And then one other species for this wetland type, the saline and alkaline wetlands. Again, another one that you might actually find across Nebraska, but definitely would be found in the saline wetlands, is the boreal chorus frog. And they'll eat insects and spiders and maybe other small creatures like that. They've got a really unique call that sounds kind of like when you take one of those combs with lots of teeth in it and you run your finger kind of hard down those teeth. The sound that makes is kind of what their sound is like. If you hold on one second, I know I have it pulled up, but I don't want to ruin our screen here. I'll try to play the sound for us. Maybe. Hopefully you guys can hear that. Okay, so this, the chorus frog, definitely for this time of year where we're not quite to summer, but we're moving slowly in that direction. This is a good time of year to hear those chorus frogs, and are often immediately out there trying to find a mate and calling as soon as it gets just warm enough. So the boreal chorus frog, I can actually hear it from my house. So there's definitely a lot of them around. They're a pretty popular species. So back to this map, because again, keeping in mind, waters are all connected. So there's definitely going to be crossover between these different wetland types. So we can't put them in too much of a box, but this is just kind of how we like to organize them. I haven't really touched too deep on any insects. So I have just like 3 or 4 slides to cover a couple insect species, also called, I always call them macro invertebrates. They are macro, so big enough to see without a microscope, and then many of them are insects, so they are, going to be, not all of them are strictly insects because they don't all just have 6 legs, and there's all these rules, with insects to make them even more organized. But these first 2 species can be found in most all wetland types and wetland areas. Especially where the water is not moving very fast. So water striders are very common. I'm sure you've probably seen one before. They skate along the top of the water, and they use water repellent hairs on their feet that help them, balance on that surface tension. And they feed on living and dead insects. So the water strider, it's is an indicator of water quality. That's a unique thing about all of these species, is there's different, the different species you might find in a wetland habitat can tell you a lot about what that water quality looks like. So water striders going to be found in most wetland types. Their quality doesn't have to be super high for you to see one. And same thing goes with mosquito larvae. They will even, grow if you have like a kiddie pool in your backyard, and they are, they will lay their eggs in that too and survive pretty well. So not the most attractive of species. They are filter feeders that will eat algae, and you can kind of see a lot of these species will actually breathe through what you call a siphon. So they kind of have a breathing tube, and so that line represents the water, and that's kind of how they hang out in there. And then we talk about butterfly life cycles a lot, and they go through a pupa stage where they go in a chrysalis and then they come out a beautiful butterfly. Well, mosquitoes kind of do the same thing, except they come out as a mosquito that will suck our blood. So they do go into a pupa stage and eventually come out of that and have their wings. So all of these insects, usually as they grow, they shed or molt their skin and then tend to grow a little bit more. So some of them have a life cycle that involves a pupa, some of them do not. So species that indicate a little bit better water quality, at least more in the middle range. 2 of them can be the water scorpion, which if you didn't know, we do have water scorpions. They probably won't bite you. I think if they did, it would maybe kind of hurt, but it wouldn't be like a scorpion sting. But they are really a pretty harmless species. There's 2 different kind of varieties that we might be able to see here. And so you can see one looks much more like a walking stick, while the other one is a little bit thicker and looks a little bit more like a scorpion. But they have those kind of long legs that they use, similar to even how a praying mantis does, where they grab their prey and then they breathe using that long tail that has, it's their siphon where they can get water like through a straw. So water scorpions are very, very fascinating and cool to find. If you've never been macroinvertebrate dipping, I hope to hold some programs in the next year and give people a chance to get out there with some nets, but you can go on your own and also look for them. Whirligig beetles, I love these. They're so cool. They are swimming frantically in circles on the surface of the water. If you ever go kayaking or anything, you'll probably see those. And a cool thing about them is they have 4 eyes. So they have 2 on the top, and then you can see in that picture where the arrow is pointing, they have 2 under the surface. So that just kind of helps them as they swim around and they eat, smaller organisms in the water as they swim around and search for food. So obviously very sight-driven animals. And then the last 2 that I have to show you are dragonfly and damselfly. So people often get these kind of confused once they're adults. Dragonflies are going to be the ones that have their wings spread out when they land, versus a damselfly will be the ones that have their wings folded up on their back. So cool thing about dragonfly larvae is they actually will eat mosquito larvae and other insects in the water, and when they become adults out of the water. So you can see eventually they molt enough times, they'll have wings forming on their back, and eventually the last molt, they'll crawl out of the water, they'll come out, and it takes a little bit for their wings to dry out, and then they're good to go. So and then the damselfly larva is easy to kind of differentiate from the dragonfly because it's got those 3 weird propeller looking things coming out of the back of its end. Those are actually gills. So, but both of these species, when they're larvae, will have the wing buds on their back, and they'll have 6 legs, very typical of most insects. They have some antenna. And so those are things to just kind of watch for if you're ever in an aquatic or wetland habitat. These would indicate fairly good water quality. And then there are some other species that indicate very high water quality, like the caddisfly and the stonefly. I didn't include those because I think at least I don't see them where I live, but they could be seen in Nebraska for sure, especially in some of our cold water streams where the water is extremely clear and cold. So yeah, so here's just a couple of the resources that I included, but there are more. So I'll be sure to send those out in the next couple days with just some other information. And then with that, Amber, do I have any questions? Does anybody have any?
We just had a few questions about, for example, do the boreal chorus frogs only call at night, but they do call during the day as well, especially during breeding season?
Yeah, yep. They would call in both times of day, yeah.
Yeah. I think that's mostly it. We just had some comments. Darlene, thanks so much for joining us. It sounds like Darlene really enjoys the Saline Wetlands near her home in Lincoln near the Capitol Beach. She says she sees a lot of animals there and enjoys them quite a bit. So that's really great.
Yeah, that's the amazing thing about our, urban wetlands. I grew up in Omaha and now I live near Lincoln. So those are mostly the wetlands I've had access to, and Riverine as well. But it's pretty awesome, just all the diversity of species that they support, even if they don't necessarily fit in a category. So
do we have any other questions for Grace before?
Yeah, please feel free to put those in the chat. For some reason it's not showing up for me, so I'll just stop sharing so that goes away.
Okay. Grace, I thought your presentation was aesthetically beautiful as well, and I loved all the photos that you had. Where are some of those photos from?
Yeah, actually, a lot of them come from the program Canva. So I always try to make sure I know for sure that they're the species they say they are, because sometimes when you're using them from a big generator like that, they're not always correct. But
yeah, so like the Platte River Basin photos and stuff.
Yeah, Platte Basin time lapse I have a few photos from them in here, and so they they're part of a project that we're working on called the Wetland Outreach and Education Project. And we're working with them to create some resources that we can use for education and really help people understand our wetland ecosystems in Nebraska. So that's just a tip of the iceberg, but that program they put on was really amazing. If you ever get the chance to watch it, they show off some of their really cool photographs and videos that they've collected so far. And Ted is on here, and he's a big part of that project and making that project happen. And so you'll be seeing a lot more from that as time goes on. So pretty amazing.
Awesome.
Yeah. If nobody else has questions, that's totally fine. Thank you for joining us today. I hope maybe you learned a little bit of something new. Again, like I said, I only could cover so many things, but there's a lot more out there. So hopefully you get a chance to visit one of these wetland types if you've never been to one. And yeah, I think I'll end it there if nobody has any more questions. So.
All right, thank you.
All right, thanks for joining me, Amber.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, have a great night, everybody.